All right, I'm going to get started just to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'm going to call us to order at 6 p.m. And we have Chris as our minute taker. I just want to let board members know that when Patrick and I were creating this agenda, we weren't sure that if Nate would be able to join us or not, and he is able to join us. So I'm going to switch around item A and B under board management and governance so that Nate will be first since he's joining us, and we can hear from him and help inform some of our later discussions. So at this time, is there any public comment? You want to raise your hand or? Okay. All right, I'm not seeing any, oh, no, I'm not seeing any hands up. So, okay. We have approved minutes, but we don't have any minutes to attach. So we are not going to do that tonight. And so our next item is a discussion with an update from Nate Levinson. So I saw him a minute ago. Everybody's hopped around.
There you go, I'm back.
Oh, there you are. Welcome, Nate. I'm glad you could join us.
And I very much appreciate your moving the schedule around for me as well.
No problem.
Great. Well, so it's good to be back. At least my sense of the conversation we had, that it was a few things. One, I and you each appreciated that this is complicated. That was certainly part of my messaging. And I think that the complication comes from, one, the need for stakeholder engagement, but not just listening or sharing with them, but there's really this issue of trust. And again, I think everybody involved is trustworthy. I'm always nervous when I talk about trust, because I'm not suggesting people are not trustful, but if you aren't part of the process, people tend to trust it less. If you are an actor in the process, you sometimes trust it less. And so what I've put together for you all is something to think about, is a process for moving forward. And I think, the goal of this process, and I shared with you just a quick 2-page summary of this if you wanted to read along. No PowerPoint tonight, just a conversation. But the goal of the process, it's a good process if, one, that you consider multiple alternatives. I shared with you before that if the single most perfect plan in the world is presented, it will not pass. When you have only one choice, it very seldom feels like a choice. And you also have nothing to compare it and contrast it to. So any process has to start with that you're openly and honestly considering multiple alternatives. Second, that the community has to be heard, and maybe as importantly, feel heard. Because I do think, and as a superintendent, I have made this mistake in the past where I think I listened, I gave opportunity, but those who were doing the sharing didn't feel they were listened to. And it is, you come up short if they leave a session thinking everything hasn't been heard. I know there was some discussion about whether, based on some of the best practices, there'd be other things we want to incorporate into the plan put forward by the superintendent's cabinet. And then as you look at multiple proposals, and the idea here is a good process has multiple proposals, it's so important to have agreed upon evaluation criteria before you evaluate. I want to say that again, it's so important that everybody agrees on what the evaluation criteria should be before you start any evaluation. Otherwise, well, I can pick the criteria that's going to make my favorite plan work. Or what will happen, and I've seen this so many times, where a community group or even internal to the district, people are really liking Plan B because Plan B does X, Y, and Z. But the board was thinking, if we cannot free up $2 million in funds, like anything that doesn't get us to $2 million is not a good plan. And the folks who were really liking Plan B said, and it saves a full $100,000. And there was such a disconnect over like what good looked like that they just felt that their good plan was rejected for unreasonable reasons. And it's not just about money. It's about, is this good for staff, or is it practical? Is it legal? I guided one district where we had to ensure with the community that we were not going to break any laws. And I don't mean that facetiously, because the community felt, or some in the community, that they should go with a particular plan and get new legislation written and passed such that it wouldn't break any laws. And the committee should have in advance stipulated no new legislation as a requirement, because that would have, it factored so heavily in the decision making. So a good plan has a good process has clear criteria. It's agreed to in advance. I also think a good plan has an objective third party reviewing everything, because it's just hard to be a participant. And then lastly, and I think this is important, like the ultimate goal is that people accept the findings. I did not say that they like the findings or they even agree with the final decision. I don't think you will ever get 100% agreement on anything. But for people to feel that there was an honest process and lots of opportunity to be heard along the way. And so that to me, and I'm going to pause there for a moment as to what I thought, well, one other comment, and then I'll pause. That, you want to build a process that has those as goals, and that the stakeholder engagement, I'm thinking, has numerous elements. One is, and the superintendent shared with me, that you've received 4 proposals from the community, and I commend you all for reaching out and asking for them. I think that's a really important step. So it's not just, a district developed proposal. I think that there should be the folks who actually authored those proposals. I'm just going to call them the proposal authors for now, whether it's one or multiple people. I think you need to think of them as a separate and important group of stakeholders, and that they would have, ample opportunity to present their thinking and to hear the findings. I think it could be helpful to have a community input committee that could be larger and or different than the proposal authors. Like, you shouldn't have had to have written a proposal to have some input. And then I think you got to kind of share the findings in multiple settings, not just one and done. So let me pause there, because that's an overview of what I think a good process would have. I can talk in greater specifics in a moment, but curious whether those kind of goals resonate with folks, something else that's missing.
So are there board members who have comments or questions? If you want to, board members want to raise your hand. Rob.
Hey, Nate, thanks. Thank you for being back and for sharing that quick overview. I believe it was last week or maybe 2 weeks ago at the time. It's where the Community Engagement Committee met, and that committee, which is a subcommittee of the board, has community members. And there were multiple community members that I think are still don't feel like there's an agreement on what the nature of the problem is. So when I looked at your suggested process or goals, I guess, is that would that really be step one? Because I've heard it loud and clear at multiple different intervals along the way in the past year, that there's still a lot of community members that aren't in agreement with what the problem is.
Rob, I've thought a lot about this, both in your context and elsewhere. And not everybody's going to agree with this answer. If you were 3 weeks, 6 weeks, maybe even 6 months into having this conversation, like getting everybody to agree whether you have declining enrollment or not, I think that's important. I want to share what's really influencing my thinking. That I've done a lot of work in Western Mass. they have seen enrollment decline by about 28% steadily for almost 15 or 20 years.
Wow.
They have not had a single year in which enrollment did not decline. So essentially, you could have started in kindergarten, graduated from high school, finished college, and through that entire time, every kindergarten class was smaller than the high school class. I say all of this, Rob, because in Western Mass, they have paid 3 independent researchers a total of, I think, about $500,000 to try to convince folks that they have declining enrollment. There is probably no case in America that is more clear. So what I have found is that, like, study after study isn't going to move those who don't believe, and I think they don't believe for 2 reasons. One, they don't want it to be true, and we are all influenced, and I don't mean that in a critical way, by hoping. And then the second is, because it's a projection, you never know for sure. So you can, so here's how I'm going to suggest you think about it. That 2 parts. One, that the criteria does say that we need, that you as a board, because I do think the majority of you do believe that you're far enough along that you have declining enrollment. So I think you probably want to stipulate that. But the other part of it, which I think will buy a little bit of support, is we did talk about at our last meeting on this idea of staging decisions or scenario planning. You know, I know some people you had shared and others had that, hey, if the pandemic gets in telecommuting, work from home, and we start to see enrollment increase, hey, then we don't need to do some of this. So I think you are better off, given how far along you are and how, quite honestly, difficult it is to prove the future, that you stipulate an assumption and that you stage decisions going forward. And you know, and here's a good example of how that staging as a criteria. Imagine there were 2 equally interesting proposals, and one of which kind of requires you to pull the trigger and do everything at once. And another said, you know, we could make an incremental step next year and another one 2 years later if enrollment continued to decline, and 4 years later if it, God forbid, continued to decline further. It's like a plan that could be implemented incrementally. All of a sudden, if you set the criteria that way, is a better plan than one that got to a similar outcome, but it's an all or nothing. So I just, experience says it's time to move past the debate, but to factor in the debate into the criteria and the idea of phasing.
And Krista.
Just a follow-up to that point, Nate. So in that stage decision-making, does that mean that the board would consider asking Patrick to resubmit his recommendation in a more staged manner?
I mean, I think there are elements of it, you know, I think that the idea might be that, you know, we talked about a lot of different things at our last session. I know we covered a lot of ground. For Patrick and his team to take a look or to reflect on that, happy to be a thought partner. But if there is a strategy that allows you to phase and still move to where you need to be quick enough, I think doing it in phases, if you can, is an advantage, and it's certainly something that should be considered. And you know, a good plan also stipulates what those phases are. You know, if you know, is it next year if we're down 10 students, that triggers the first step because you are already past a point, or does it mean that you got to wait? You wait till you're down 200 students, and that's when you're going to do it. So phasing means also being pretty clear about what the triggers are, and it is possible that the first phase you've already reached it. I don't know what your phases are, but I'm presuming you've seen some enrollment decline over the last couple of years. So you might, I don't want anybody to think that phasing means that nothing would start right away, but it is different than saying we forecast another 20% drop, therefore over 5 or 10 years, therefore we're going to make a decision that sets us up, assuming that's a definite.
Kevin, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, sort of. I was mulling over. So if we do this phased approach, and I think last time you referred to it as a private business, nonprofit sort of thing, where there's a whole lot more, I don't know if you call it control, but there's a whole lot more or less interaction with a public opinion, if you will. And you know, the stage thing seems like it's reasonable, but what's the probability of that if you lay this plan out and you just hit these metrics, you're just going to kick them in? I think there's still a risk that you're going to have, you know, whether it's token or majority opposition, expressing concern at each one of these steps.
I totally agree with that, Kevin. And so just to, so it is what this is, the phasing is sometimes called scenario planning. It's like, if this happens, then we do that. And that is, the scenario planning is very common in the private sector and very common in the nonprofit sector, but not that common in K-12. That's what I shared. I agree with you that it does mean that you have multiple decisions, and each decision is an opportunity for people to fight. And that's a reason not to do it, not to phase. The flip side is, and this is where, again, I'm not suggesting you make that decision today. We need to see what the choices are. But here, there are two kinds of folks, and I'm going to super simplify and don't want to insult anybody by simplifying. But imagine there are two kinds of folks. Those who don't want to make a change, period. And I get why that could be. And yeah, no matter what data or phases happen, they don't want to make a change. But what if there really are some people of reasonable open-mindedness who just generally don't believe that the trends are trends? What if they're saying, you know, if it were true that we lost 500 kids, of course we should do X, Y, and Z. But I just really don't see that happening, Kevin. And we are really genuinely disagreeing, not about anything other than our ability to forecast the future. And I believe that COVID's changed the world, and you're going to be building 2 new schools, so many people are going to flock. You know, for those folks, and I will share, I think I'd shared with you, I was one of those people. I led a very nasty effort in town when I was a school board member. In this case, it was to build a new school. We had 5 building projects, exact opposite problem, over 10 years. I was just so tired of adding 2 classrooms here and a portable there and a wing there at the wrong time at the wrong cost. And we just, my entire life in town, I've seen the population more than double. And I just said, we got to build a 3rd school. And the people who did not want to spend the money said, well, I don't believe the population is going to grow. And I'm hearing, no, you don't, we're not arguing over population, we're arguing over tax rates. I'm willing to pay more, you're not, but we don't want to say that out loud. So we argued over projections of student enrollment. Ultimately, it was not my idea, I wished it was. A smarter person said, we should stage the decision. And they said that when enrollment hits, when enrollment in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, because those are kind of the predictions, when that enrollment hit a certain level and the number of 0 to 5-year-olds in town hit a certain level, when we hit a number, that's when we would launch the construction of the 3rd school. It pacified me because I really was open-minded enough. But I will tell you, Kevin, I knew I would have bet every dollar in my bank account that we would hit that within 2 years. I will tell you, it has been 20 years and they have not hit that number. We really just had, like, I was just so wrong about my prediction for the future, but I was really very certain. So I think for people who were certain but open-minded, the staging works. And for people who just will never like the decision, it won't. Longer story than I meant to tell, but it's none of these are perfect, and it really does get at whether, excuse me, whether it really is a disagreement about the future or just a dislike for the decision.
Any other board questions? Krista?
I'm sorry I was a couple of minutes late to the meeting, so you might have already talked about this, about the level of detail we would get into right now, or maybe that's for a little later in our agenda. But my question is, if you can kind of flesh out this community input committee idea and what that exactly entails.
Yes, and I think we would have to think this through together, and I'm not sure we would finalize or even go very far tonight, but my feeling is that there are like 4 key groups of stakeholders, if you will. There are you all, but so there's the folks who authored the proposals. I mean, they came up with some plans. I think by having taken that time and shown that level of interest, if I am leading this process, I would want to meet with them, individually, the group of Plan A and the group of Plan B, and hear from them. I want to hear their thinking. I want to understand their plan. I don't want to just read it and say, oh, I get what they're trying to accomplish and why. I think that same group is entitled to hear the findings in private as well. So like that's a group that I think deserves, I'll say, their own path through this process. I think obviously you will share findings publicly at school board meetings and other forums, and I'll call them the public at large. You can't have a conversation with your entire public. You know that. I mean, we got 33 participants on this meeting tonight. So I have found that somewhere between that very small group of people who went to all the effort to build proposals and the large group called everybody, is that having a group of folks who you all determine are important, influential, representative, hopefully a cross section, that is the community input committee. It really does need to be under 25. It can definitely be more than half a dozen. I think it's a longer discussion of who should be on it, but that group, obviously they're both representative, thoughtful, and engaged. They should be consulted a number of times along the way. Like, for example, setting the criteria. I'd want to hear what that group thinks about the criteria. And I think they're a good sounding board for me. I think they're a good sounding board for you all. It's a way for some people who want to really have a bigger role to have a bigger role. But you will notice that it was called the Community Input Committee. You may come up with a nicer name. It was not the Community Decision-Making Committee. Like you're not abrogating this to a vote, but I do think having a group have a number of check-ins along the way is really helpful. And if we did it, I think it's a separate meeting, longer discussion to think about the number, and who those players are.
I guess, sorry, Don, can I ask a follow-up on that, or is there?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I guess I was also just wondering, are they, where are they, where is their participation in the process? And you answered part of that, they would help to develop the evaluation criteria.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't sound like they would also help to actually evaluate proposals.
No, the two things I would like them to do is one, to help evaluate, to help set the evaluation criteria. The other thing that can be helpful is if they got a private screening of a draft set of findings. And so, you know, you share the findings and they say, wait a minute. You're saying Plan B is going to do X, Y, and Z? No, we don't see it that way. And I think, you know, having a sounding board, you know, as a reviewer, you don't always get 100 things right. And I don't live in your community, or you say, so I think them having them as a sounding board to get kind of preliminary findings before a report is finalized does two things. One, it will make it a better report. Two, if there was a misunderstanding or a misread of the community, it's going to get caught. And three, it does make them feel like they had some more voice in this. And again, but nothing should imply that they get a vote and they get to pick, because I think that obviously is not your intention and not the best way to make a decision.
Rob?
Nate, what would be your preferred or ideal timeline moving forward? I know it's an item on our agenda, but I'd like to hear from you before we discuss it as a board.
You know, this is one of those things where you want to move as quick as you can, but not too quickly, which I know is a bad answer. I think this is probably, if we didn't have the summer, let's assume we were not dealing with the summer. This is about a 3 to 4 month process. I find that people can't like give input, evaluate, hear it, go back and forth. If you rush it much faster than that, I fear that people feel less heard and that it's less thoughtful. So it is about 4 months. That does not mean that like people are working heads down straight for the 4 months. The summer is tricky. I have had communities where we've tried to do some pretty important work over the summer, and it is really backfired. People felt, whoa, you are trying to sneak this under the radar, doing it when nobody's around. And which was never the intent. It was just like a desire to move quickly. And in some communities, doing it in the summer, you know, is pretty poorly perceived as high quality engagement. I've had other places where it seemed not to be an issue. And so I don't really know how folks in your communities would view this in the summer. I do know that if somebody is very engaged in this and goes away for a month and we have an important meeting during that month, they will be really mad for a long, long time. Now, this is a Zoom world, so maybe it's less of an issue because, you know, we're going to do a lot of this by Zoom and they could zoom in. So I think you just need to think about whether doing, like, you know, there's parts of this that's like analysis or working with the district. Doing that in the summer is fine, but the engagement part, I just don't know your community well enough to whether people would feel that's not reasonable process for engagement. And that just adds more time to the finish date.
Okay. Oh, Krista?
I'm sorry, I have so many questions. I guess I'm just wondering, so it sounds like your suggestions, Nate, are predicated on the idea that really we would be hiring you to be the sole evaluator.
Well, maybe that's a good segue before I answer. Maybe it's a good segue to walk you through a process I'm suggesting. And yes, the process I am suggesting has a sizable role for me and some others on my team. But let me maybe walk you through the process. I can perhaps answer some of the questions as we go, and that might answer that question as well.
Sure.
Great. So this is page 2 of the handout. And so 9-step process. Step 1 I think just really important is communicate the approach to the community. So important that, you know, the announcement be clear about who's doing what, the time frame, when there will be stakeholder input and how it will happen, all kind of the rules of engagement, if you will, and the opportunities for input should definitely be put out first. And, you know, I think also being clear about that, you know, how the final decision will be made, presumably a vote of the school board, but you don't want people thinking, you know, that the community, you know, the input committee or others are taking a vote. So good communication up front, definitely step one. This is predicated on the assumption that there are going to be 5 plans to evaluate, 4 from the community and 1 from the district leadership team. I think that the next step would be to meet with each of the teams. I don't know whether it's teams or individuals who put together those community proposals. I'd want to hear from them directly. What were they trying to accomplish? Walk me through the plan. How did they think about this, that, and the other? Because I think it's so important that they know if I'm going to be doing an evaluation of them, of their plans, that they know that I have heard everything they wanted me to know about their plan. And if there are parts or pieces or questions that are vague, that they have a chance to, you know, flesh it out. So that's kind of step 2. Step 3 was to probably work with the district leadership team to update based on the best practices and any new thinking, a district developed plan, which if it can include staging, might want to. And so at that point, by step 3, there are 5 plans that are fleshed out, understood, and these are our 5 options worth considering. Then you move into this developing the evaluation criteria. You know, my presumption would be that I'd take the first stab at it, but it's not my criteria. I mean, this is not my decision. I don't want it to be, but I could probably kickstart the conversation by saying, hey, here's 5 or 8 criteria that others have used, and then getting feedback from both the board and the community input committee on those criteria. And at the end of that step, we have said, hey, these are the 9 ways we're going to evaluate it. And then I and others, this is not just the Nate show, but there'd be a team of us. One of the other people who I want to bring in is somebody I've worked with quite a bit on all that work in Western Mass. We did about 4 years worth of work looking at similar challenges there, former superintendent, former consultant. So it'd be a few of us looking at it. And then we would evaluate each plan, not as good or bad, but how's it do on criteria 1? How's it do on criteria 2? As far as the fiscal impact, because plans have both dollars and non-dollar things about them, I think to have a common and consistent way of evaluating the dollars, this is where I'd want to work closely with the district, you know, business office to help run those numbers. And ideally, you want to get to a place where both I and my team were independent and fairly financially savvy, and Patrick and his team, who know the ins and outs of the district, say, yes, these numbers, these financial impacts for all 5 plans are both reasonable and consistently calculated. And that way we've got both the qualitative and quantitative side of this. And then I want to produce a report, something that can be shared with the public. But again, the report, just to be very clear, will not say, do I do option 3, or Nate recommends option 3. Not going to happen. And you don't want that. I'm going to say that, you know, option 3 does very well. It meets all the criteria, all the goals of criteria 1, 5, and 7. Gets you a little bit of the way on these 3 criteria. On these criteria, it actually doesn't meet the criteria at all. And were you to do it, you could anticipate a financial impact of X. So you will have what I would say is, as a decision-making group, very objective and consistent assessment of each of the proposals, financial and non-financial, and how they stack up against criteria that you've, in theory, agreed upon. I think with a draft report, this is where, again, we can debate this, but I think with a draft set of findings, it could be helpful to meet back with the authors and with the input committee. And if they say, what do you mean this doesn't save $1 or one teacher? We thought you'd do X, Y, and Z. And I can say, no, that wouldn't be allowed by law, or class sizes don't allow it, or I'll say, tell me more about how you think that could happen. Because we don't, this is not a game of gotcha. It's, I really want to understand everything that they were thinking. And by sharing back how I've processed it, they get a chance to say, no, you didn't understand us well. Because that's the last thing you want, is when you have a final report, people saying, he didn't get it, or they didn't listen. And so I think, I will tell you as a consultant, those are very unpleasant meetings, because the whole point of them is for people to pick holes in your own work, but they're very productive. And sometimes people say, yep, agree completely. And sometimes they say, these are areas we disagree. And at a minimum, and in many times it'll lead to a change in the report, or it could, at a minimum, it leads to like the note in the report that says, you know, the consultants believe X, but the authors believe differently. So even there, we are giving people the voice. They're seeing things differently, and that's also of value. With that comes the final report, which I think you then need to share, obviously, amongst yourselves and through some community outreach as well. So that's a process that really creates the fact base for you to make a decision. And, you know, along the way, you know, again, because I do think the phasing could be possible, could be beneficial. Even if people didn't phase their proposals, as a reviewer, if I see opportunities to phase, you know, we'll definitely add that, because again, it's not a requisite that you do it. It's just simply one more tool for you to consider. So let me pause there. That's how I'm thinking this process could work. I think it could get you to both a good decision and a decision that most, but not everybody, could live with. And I think that many would appreciate that you did it in a very thoughtful way.
Kevin?
For the financial impact, and maybe this is a Patrick or probably a joint question, but there are a number of the proposals, so I'm not sure all of them, but most of them deal with statements of interactions with adjacent districts that may or may not be interested in sharing financials or what ifs on these scenarios. And I just wonder how we make that real.
That's a great question. As we know, as the merger study committee has recently launched, any significant collaboration, like what some of the proposals might be mentioning, would require a process of all of their own to really explore that possibility. You know, at this point, the fact that Addison Central has expressed that at least at this point, they're not interested in joining the merger study, I think that's indicative of some of the challenges in doing this work, not because they're necessarily disinterested, but they have their own process and timeline that they're in the midst of. And it does get complicated, but the reality is they would require their own timeline and set of processes to engage in those conversations and lead to any decisions about county merger or combined middle high schools or high schools, career centers, et cetera, to advance that work.
Although, and I agree with all of that, although I do think that our ability to do what's generally called back of envelope calculations coupled with the assumptions. Like you can do, Kevin, I believe, kind of typical case, like when we've seen this happen elsewhere. You know, you might save X, Y, and Z, it's 5%, it's 30%, it's all of the administration, it's none of the teachers. There are ways of estimating. It's clearly not as precise as, but I think it also says a couple things. One, it's an estimate. And if the estimate is really low, because we've done this before, it lets people know that, you know, even if this worked, it's not a huge money saver. If the estimate is potentially large, you know, the footnote, of course, or more than a footnote, is that this is just an estimate and it's contingent on these things happening. And so we can lay out what would make it a big savings. And then I think becomes one more factor for you to consider that, like, hey, if we could do this, and if these 3 or 4 things were true, then the financial impact's pretty significant. And then you all as decision makers can say, what are the odds that they would go with that? Maybe it is so appealing that you'd say, hey, we would really want to go into a deep conversation with folks to see other folks to see if that's true. Or what often happens, though, I will admit, that, you know, the best case scenario, the savings are not that big, or the decision, the way you get the big savings is so objectionable that people say, we don't need to run any more detail. It's not big enough, or it's not appealing enough, and doesn't matter what the number, you know, what the more detail shows. So I think we could have some financial thoughts, just not as specific.
Steve?
So Nate, you'd mentioned last time that the principals group was a key group to sort of get on board or hear their thoughts and get them to buy into a scenario. How does that group fit into this process?
Thank you for throwing my own words back at me, Steve. No, I think that's a really good point. I think one of 2 ways, and I'm going to confess right now, they're not explicitly mentioned here and should have been, which is why I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think we can do one of 2 things, and I'll tell you what my recommendation will be. One is you could put some principles on the community input board, or we add the principals as their own very important stakeholder group. And again, meet with them to review the criteria, share the findings in draft form with them as well, so that they really do feel like they have been part of this process throughout. Because I lean towards treating them as their own special group rather than including them in the others.
Any other questions? Krista?
Yeah, I'm just wondering a little bit about your thinking around what seems like more of a backseat role for the board as far as evaluating proposals, like hearing from the community proposers, for example.
I'm sorry,
If you're thinking around that, I guess.
I'm sorry, say that one more time. I missed a word or 2 of your question.
Sure, sorry. I was just wondering what you think the value is around the board having a little more of a backseat role in especially hearing from the community proposers, as opposed to you doing that work on our behalf.
You know, I have, Patrick and I had discussed this. I am of two minds. So on one hand, and I think I had shared with you prior, I generally lean towards like the board listening to their community and maybe me in the back of the room. Like that is one strategy where the kind of the board is, actively engaged in seeking this input. And I've been in other communities, like people actually want the independent person. They want direct contact with somebody who's going to be writing a report. I don't think there's an absolute right or wrong on this. I think to some degree, and if the community views you all as, I want to say this nicely, neutral, independent arbiters who are just trying to get the facts, there can be, and you really just are here to listen, I could see a bigger role for the board in gathering the input. If the community sees you all as, or many of you as having kind of made up your mind, see, you're not starting from scratch. I'm starting early with you all, but if the board thinks, Krista wants this and Paul wants that and Nancy wants that, then I don't think I think there's value to have a person who, quote, doesn't have a horse in this race listening. And so I think there's, it's a good discussion. I don't think there's a right or wrong. And, there's that middle ground where, if we're getting the feedback where you all kind of kick it off, so people show that you show that you hear, you're there, you care, you want to know, you turn it over to an independent party to kind of facilitate, but you're listening. So I think there's some middle grounds as well. But I don't think there's a clear good or bad answer.
And I should also say that based on our prior board conversations, I talked to Nate right after the workshop, expressed the conversation the board had following. Nate shared some thoughts about more of a backseat role for himself in this process. The responses I was hearing from the board was an interest in having Nate play a more active role. I shared that with Nate, which prompted this more active approach that he's sharing tonight, which is exactly why I think it's great we're having this conversation. I'm happy that Nate could be here tonight so we can get some clarity around the role the board wants Nate to play in this process.
Yeah, I am very flexible. And yes, I had initially anticipated a less public facing role. And again, and I've done both.
Okay. Steve, I'll go to you next, but Rob, can you mute? I think I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if anybody else is hearing it. Thanks. Okay, Steve.
Nate, I was curious also if after sort of the initial scan of the proposals, whether you felt there was room for you to make your own.
Here's where I would think about that. So one is I have not seen or been given the proposals, and I didn't want them. I don't work for you yet. So I would say, Steve, my initial reaction would be twofold. One is I envision, consulting with Patrick and his leadership team on both the district developed plan. So at a minimum, my thinking and suggestions will certainly be shared with the district leaders, and that may end up showing up in that plan. I think the other thing I could see doing, because I want to be very, very respectful to folks who put together their own plans, but I could easily see, and I've done this in a number of times where I've evaluated other people's plans. So imagine somebody has submitted a plan. It does not score very well on like criteria 1, 3, and 9. I'm pretty comfortable, putting into the plan, and here is a suggestion that would improve how you meet, how you do on that criteria that seems consistent with the general thrust of the plan. So I would not want to rewrite anybody's plan, but again, if we saw some weaknesses based on the criteria, I'm very comfortable suggesting a couple options to, and ultimately,
I think those
choosing.
I think those comments are great. I think my question was more towards, I've seen all the proposals, including the superintendent's, and I see that you've all missed the forest for the trees. And there's X that nobody's considered. And whether there's an opportunity for you to throw that out into the discussion, that's all.
I mean, certainly one of the steps, step 3, is to review with the district leadership their plan. And I think that'll be, Patrick and I seem to have very open, honest conversations. It's a no hold bars kind of, if I see things that are missing or don't make sense to me, I will definitely share them with them.
Don, you're muted.
Sorry, Kevin.
So I generally like this proposal, and I think there's a lot of value. Just listening to different little tidbits here and there of things that we don't think of necessarily, or certainly don't put in the right context. I think this process as it's laid out is valuable. My concern, going back to Chris's question about board involvement, is I believe the board doesn't necessarily or should necessarily have to be conducting alongside of you or instead of you, but I'm concerned that the board ends up, to turn back seat, that the board ends up not engaged to the process, if nothing more than in the peanut gallery, if you will, and ending up at the end looking at a final report and say, well, I don't know anything about anything. You know, I think we as a board need to remain engaged and connected through the whole process. Maybe as if nothing else, as a totally engaged audit mentality.
If I can respond, Kevin, I agree with you. So let me start with that. And I am very open to, it's a tricky dance. It's like what's not enough engaged and what's too much engaged. And I think you all are going to be a better measure of that than I am, because you should know your community better than I do. I mean, certainly I think you should be at a minimum part of setting the criteria, which we already have. I think you can think about how to listen in or participate, but I don't think lead kind of some of the community input discussions. And I'm certainly open, and we don't need to, we don't need to finalize it tonight, but as you think about how you want to be engaged, I'm very open to that. So I mean, don't think that this was a plan intentionally intended. I spent 6 years in your seat, so I know your role. If you tell me how you want to be engaged, we can incorporate that into the plan.
Okay, Brad?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Sorry I was late. As a new board member, I was kind of roped into a Vermont State Board Association meeting, which I was able to do for a while and then log off. But anyway, I guess I had a question. I think the proposal sounds really good to me, but I was wondering how in this process we engage so maybe more non-traditional interests. I'm specifically thinking about I've had a conversation not too long ago with a member of our town's local planning board, planning and zoning board, and they were really interested in finding how they could have greater input into the process as this moves forward. And I was wondering if you had any strategies about how we should or shouldn't be trying to engage more institutional actors.
Sure. Great question, Brad. So, and I've definitely seen, again, like the work in Western Mass, The planning board was very engaged. But not the whole board. I forget how many folks were. So I think this comes to a question you don't need to answer today. Oh, this could also be another place, Kevin, where the board's going to be involved, is if we know we're going to have this community input committee, sorry. The makeup of that, usually you want to do it in this kind of two-step process. Like step one says, hey, we're going to have 20 people, and here's the generic makeup. We want 2 town officials, we want 2 teachers, we want 4 parents. You kind of define what the buckets are of those 20 positions, those 20 seats. And that's conversation one, and there are no names attached to it. Then there's the second step where either you ask for volunteers or you reach out to people. I've seen it done both ways, but you already, before you started putting names forward, you've already said, but we're only going to have 2 town officials, and we're only going to have 3 of these people, so they can understand how it got chosen and why. And I think, where'd you go? I think, Brad, the idea of if you want to have some of the kind of town folks or the people who are really, this is their kind of technical expertise, that's a good way to incorporate them so that they've got some voice and some engagement. Only rule is you cannot bring the committee up to 100.
Any other questions about Nate, comments? Or anyone need clarity? Anything else? Kristen Blanchett.
Yeah, I just want to say this feels good in the sense that we are trying to reinvent the wheel, and you have sort of hammered some wheels out. It doesn't mean we're gonna, whatever comes out, we can still, we're going to analyze the data essentially, which I think, and you'll know more what kind of data we should be analyzing. So I think that makes sense. Just to address one thing that I know some people have said in other meetings, we don't want people from far away helping us because they don't understand us. And I think something that I grew up in Massachusetts, Nate. I stayed in Coolidge Corner this weekend near there, picking my daughter up from college. So I think since I've moved here many, many years ago, pretty much in northern New England, I think everyone has some duct tape and they feel they will generally try to figure out or fix anything. And they might ask their neighbors to help, but and that is really cool. But in some situations, we do need people who have expertise. So while I appreciate that spirit here, and it makes for great neighbors and people helping, put up the playground and stuff, this is a very specialized area. And even, Patrick and his crew have never done this before. So I would appreciate this input. Anyway, so I agree with the plan.
Okay, and Krista.
I was just wondering if we have thoughts on how to move this part, like what's next for us. So we have some things to chew on. We've asked some good questions. What's next?
And certainly one thing that'd be helpful to me, obviously you need to decide. I've certainly, and my goal tonight was not just to present, but to actually hear your feedback. And I think there've been a number of very good improvements. Steve, about the principles. I think, thinking about the makeup of the input committee. And I also think, and those are definite, those are just like really good ideas. I think the one thing that's still a bit of an open question is what is the right role for the board? And again, I am very open to, you should be the experts on that, not me. And so one thing that would be helpful before we can maybe finalize this is just to give me some guidance on which steps and ways in which you want to be involved and which ways and steps you want me to be a little more forward. And know that I'm good wherever that line is drawn. I just want some clarity. And I think that to me, at least, is the only real open, no, that's one open question. Second open question is doing substantial stakeholder engagement over the summer. Is that going to backfire or not? And I don't know, but I'd like you to tell me what you all think. I think with those two pieces of information, I could flesh this out into, vastly more detail, timetable, cost, roles, who's the team going to be, et cetera. So that's from my needs.
Steve?
So Krista, I know you guys spent quite a bit of time in your last meeting putting something similar together. And I keep looking at it here because it was sent out to discuss tonight. Is there anything missing in Nate's discussion that you guys had incorporated into your path that we might want to, put together?
Well, I guess my question about what's next was more, I appreciate the questions from you, Nate, to what we should be thinking about. But I was wondering, will we be carving out time to try to answer what Nate's brought up as our questions? And when will that be? And I think part of that might be looking at what the Community Engagement Committee discussed. I'm just trying to gauge where we are with, this has been really helpful. But I think we need some time as a board to talk through some of the questions and the recommendations from the Community Engagement Committee. So I'm trying to figure out what that might look like, and maybe you don't know yet.
Is that a question? Sorry, is that a question?
No, I'm really looking to Don and
okay.
Patrick.
I was hoping, Krista, I was hoping you were looking somewhere other than it.
Yes, I'm just wondering, how do we? Yeah. So what's how do we see this unfolding?
So I think some of it will come from further discussion, but maybe there's some parts that we can give some clarity. I mean, just around the summer question, we might be able to all kind of give input right now about the idea of trying to work through this in the summer. That'll give Nate a piece of information he needs. It also might be helpful to hear from all of us our vision of that role for the board right now. I mean, and it can certainly come up again later in the discussion, but it might be helpful for Nate to hear right now what board members think their role is. I see Dave has his hand up, so I guess we're going to start down this path.
Thank you. That's not my phone.
That's me.
So I think we can do some work over the summer. Listening, it seems to me that if there was a team that had a couple of board members, Nate, or a staff member from his organization, and a couple of staff people from our district, and a couple of people from presenting proposal. And I don't think they need to be the same. I think they can be different. The purpose of the groups would be to put together each proposal in a way that they can be presented in a side-by-side. I've skimmed through some of the proposals, and they are disparate enough in my mind that comparing one proposal to another is extremely difficult. And when that happens, it seems to me it breaks down into people's perceptions and prejudices or preconceptions of directions where things go. If these smaller groups can follow some guidelines and it will have some consistency from Nate's organization and our staff. So working with the proposers of the various proposals to provide an outline or of each of those proposals in such a way that the board can hear them in a comparative manner, and we can begin to ask questions that highlight the differences and comparisons between the various proposals. Just a thought.
Maybe Don, if I could just interject for a moment, I want to check Nate's availability as we start down what could be a lengthy conversation. I want to make sure that Nate's good on time. We're a little over an hour at this point.
I can stay about another half an hour.
Okay.
Thanks, Patrick. Steve, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was wondering, Don, if you wanted to just do your roll call thing and see how everybody's,
We could. That.
get everybody's temperature.
All right. Let's just see.
Could we do it with each question separate, like
Yes.
summer, and then maybe do it that way?
Yes. So, how about if you're in support of just a straw poll, not an official vote, but if you're in support of working over the summer, give me a thumbs up so I can see how many. 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I see 8 over the summer. And so how about not working over the summer? I would join you, Rob.
Can I say I'm somewhere in the middle? I think we got to be careful about setting sights too high. I'm not saying we can't do anything over the summer, but I think, coming out of COVID and just summer, it's going to be hard to get people's attention.
Right. I would agree with that. And I would also point out, like in the past, when we've tried to do work, even negotiating over the summer, it didn't work well for the teachers, and because they have other things that happen in the summer. So that's where my thought went. It's never worked well. Rob?
Oh, sorry. One thought that might be a middle ground is if you look at steps 1 through 4, the only people that the primary people I'd be meeting with, if in steps 1 through 4, are the authors of the proposals and district leadership. My hunch is with that group, it's Zoom. I can do it from my house in Maine. I suspect they will want to talk to me. We can work around, leaderships. I think that group, because they're so, I'll say, hyper engaged, I suspect we could have some conversations with those two groups. I think moving into step 5, which is a much larger group, that's where I think, Don, what you shared and others shared might make sense. So it might be a way to get some of the more, well, say, technical fleshing out stuff done. So we're getting a running start for the fall.
You sort of tee it up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And it will knock a good 6+ weeks off the end date by doing that.
That sounds great. Rob?
Yeah, just to, as Brad said, think like where my head was at with that question and why I said no to it. I do completely agree with Nate. It seems like there's some nuts and bolts that could happen over the summer. I think the engagement part should come in the fall because it's been a really long year for a lot of people, a lot of families in our community, and obviously our school district. And with vaccines and maybe some ability to experience the world again, I don't know if people are going to really have the bandwidth to want to engage in this conversation, and maybe just sort of table it for a little bit in the back of their mind, or at least personally I would like a little break. Not that I would stop thinking about it, But then something I'm also cognizant of is the, you know, the merger study committee. And granted, I know that's not happening in a vacuum. And we'll have board members on it, Nate, but this other committee, by sort of statute, you know, in our proposed timeline that they're working with, that they can change. They're looking to wrap up by December of this year, if not January. And if they do, certain things are out of our hands as a board then, if it goes to the state. And so that's something I'm also looking at too. If they're wrapping up by December, and they make a decision before we're done doing our engagement process, if it takes 4 months, I don't know where that could leave us. I'm just thinking worst case
You know,
scenario.
I think, Rob, I think you just gave us our end date. I think even without doing substantial engagement over the summer, I think, at least my initial reaction is you'd want both those studies done around the same time. So that you don't want to compare and contrast, you know, merger study with some of these own options. So I think we could, finishing by December, I think is fine.
Yeah, but that's also a moving target because we don't know for sure that the merger committee will be done by then either.
Right. But they probably won't be done any sooner than that.
Dave?
That's what I was thinking when I made my suggestion. A limited agenda for summer work that is more about ironing out some of the proposals so that when they're looked at by a larger group, it can be more understandable.
Yep.
Okay. I think we have kind of have consensus there around that, you know, that idea of the summer. And thanks for the suggestion, Nate. Now I'm going to go on to the role of the board, just so we can all have a chance to give Nate our thoughts on what we think. You know, front seat, back seat, listening were some of the options that were presented. So let's start down our list. And how about Sarah LaPearl? We haven't heard from you.
Sorry, I was at my County Virgin's lacrosse team. A little late to this party. I guess I'm more interested in having some accountability to stay engaged, but I don't really want to have a front seat. That's where I'm at.
Okay. And Liz is not with us tonight. So Andrew.
So I'm looking through the list and trying to think about all the ways the board can be involved. And so each particular one, I guess I'm not coming up with some clear specific ideas. I think I'm thinking more broadly about the limited role or the voice of the board so far as individual board members and how we represent individual towns, and that while we represent the district as a whole, which I have always sort of seen as the first priority, every individual town has its own culture and different ideas about things. And I think, and there's been differences in enrollment from school to school. So I think maybe having that voice somehow involved, especially, I never thought I would say this, but I feel like sort of a veteran board member at this point, especially on the unified board, where I have a sense of, I know what the budget cycles look like, and I know the trend line for the enrollment projections. I remember once I figured out how the budget worked and what the enrollment looked like, I thought, uh-oh, here comes the iceberg. So it's trying to include that voice for board members who have just seen it, because we're not the administration and we're not the public. We're sort of that middle place. So anyway, I'm not sure what that looks like, but those are my thoughts.
Brad?
Yeah, briefly, I mean, I don't see it as a binary choice, frankly. I think that if we're engaging in a process and working with Nate, someone who we think brings a lot to the table, I think there might be some things where the board could take the lead, and some things where it make more sense for him to take the lead. I'm just not sure that, again, it's a binary choice.
Okay, thank you. Steve?
I think so. We're planning on having some board representation on the community input committee. Is that correct?
Undetermined. No, I don't think, at least from my perspective, we haven't had that conversation. You could or you could not.
Well, that I think, frankly, the board should be able to participate in that committee to the extent that they're interested. That would be my suggestion. That if they want to be on that committee, they should have the right to be on that committee and participate at the level they want to participate and their availability. I think that plugs them into the process in a meaningful location, and each can have their own ability to play the part in the discussion that they want to have.
Kevin?
I kind of tipped my hat in a previous conversation, but I like this layout. I like the thought that we're going to seek some new faces for this community input committee, for a broad representation, if you will, something that would be preferably would be in theory unbiased, if you will. I think Sarah had a good word, accountable, and I think the board needs to remain accountable to the process and cognizant and not necessarily participating in it, but understanding what the process is and how it's unfolded and all the nuances of the activity that Nate's going to lead, so that at the end of the day, we are informed and not having second thoughts or guesses, or we didn't know that or didn't know this type thing. So I think we don't need to participate, but we need to remain understanding firsthand of the process and how it unfolds.
Okay, Dave Sharp?
So in the end, I presume the board will be taking a vote on what pathway to take. And I want to make an informed, I want to cast an informed ballot. I doubt I can make every meeting all the time, but I sure would like to understand the proposals by the time I have to vote on it.
Rob?
Oh, sorry.
I agree with pretty much what all's been said. I think Steve brings up a good point. If a board member would want to engage, so I'll always be a community member, and at some point I'll have been a school board member, but I'll be a community member, and maybe leave a spot or two. But I completely agree with Sarah and Kevin. I think we need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to be informed, part of the process. But I would love to take a little bit of the weight off my own personal shoulders in regards to, being in the room all the time, talking. I want to sort of sit back and listen and gather more information along this process. So that's where I'm at right now.
Okay, Kristen Blanchett?
What do you think, Patrick? No. I think that, yeah, I would like to hear what Patrick thinks of all this. I'm just wondering how it fits into policy governance. And I'm glad that we are having someone who has analyzed data like this before, analyzing it for us, and then we can analyze it and make our decisions maybe along the way and then certainly at the end.
Okay, Sandy? Oops.
Can I unmute? Sorry, I was having problems there. Thanks, Dawn. I'm just recently on the Community Engagement Committee, and we talked about this quite a bit last week. I think it's even part of policy governance. You know, a lot of our role as a board is to be the community linkage and making sure that where I think as a board can be accountable by making sure we take a role in maybe the decision of what the community input committee will be. Not necessarily being on it, that might not be the ultimate decision, but being part of helping to make sure that we have a good representation for those who will be evaluating the criteria. And then I'm not exactly sure about one, but anything that has to do with communication, I think, again, the board can really be, maybe we can play a role of reaching out and figuring out how to reach out to the community to bring all the different viewpoints into the process so that they're heard and they can feel like they can participate as well by being heard.
Okay. And Krista.
So for the board role, I think that it would be great if we could hear the community proposals as they're presented with Nate and hear Patrick's update to his proposal. You know, I think it would be important for us to have that opportunity, excuse me. I also am thinking like Sandy about the places for community input. It sounds like if we're going to not try to accomplish all of this over the summer, that we have some more time to think about that piece. But I'm thinking specifically about the evaluation criteria, and that it would be great for us to spend time determining where we can get input from folks beyond a specific committee on that criteria. So those are my reasons.
No, someone mentioned hearing from Patrick. Does the board want to hear from Patrick? I'm seeing some heads nodding. Yes. Patrick, what are your thoughts?
First of all, I greatly appreciate a third-party sort of neutral assessment of all of the proposals that are put forward. I think that's really key in this, because there is so much sort of emotion and relationship, and there's a lot mixed into this. I also really appreciated sort of a combination of things that I was hearing were for board members to be accountable to understanding the process and the various proposals and being very much in the know while primarily listening. I think that combination of deep listening and accountable to understanding makes sense to me. As the group that ultimately makes the decision about what and how something advances.
Kristen?
So this essentially means that we'll be doing another budget cycle of where we're at, because this process wouldn't be done until December. So just, is that correct, Patrick, that pretty much?
Yeah, so we really would be looking at, I think it's unlikely that the timing of this, like it'll be mid-budget cycle toward the end of budget cycle for FY23. So I think it's unlikely that we would be making swift and significant change based on this process for FY23, given that timeline.
And then looking at the numbers, I mean, that's just the way it's going to be, but just looking at the numbers and the projections and stuff, does that mean that next year will be a difficult budget year?
Yeah, I do think it will be a difficult budget year. I think some of the decisions happening legislatively are making FY23 look less scary than it might have several months ago, with sort of a delay to any decision or action on the weighting study. I think there's a good chance that the school construction coming off of the cost per equalized pupil and the spending threshold anyway is going to help. So I think there are some legislative decisions or lack thereof that are going to help FY23. I can't say that we're going to, be unscathed in terms of having to make some hard decisions, but it isn't going to be as significant as we were initially projecting based on what I know today. I always want to throw that caveat in there because things certainly have a way of changing, but based on my read right now, that's my sense. Floyd, I don't know if you feel differently about the budget projections, but that's where my thinking is.
I think you're right on the nose. It looks a little bit better. I'm a little more optimistic, though I think it's just kicking the can down the road. So 2014 now becomes a little scarier, or 2024 becomes a little scarier for us. But I think better next year than projections even 3 or 4 months ago.
Okay, Kevin?
Just a point of order. I don't think you called on Annie for input.
Oh, I didn't see her. Annie, do you have any input? Sorry, I didn't see you.
That is not a problem at all. Thanks loads, Kevin. I apologize for being late. I had to work late. I was, mostly listening and taking everything in because I know I missed a lot at the beginning, but I will say that I definitely agree with Rob and Steve as far as the fact that I will always be a community member, and like Rob said, at some point I will have been on the board. So I want to make sure that I am always engaged, even after I am no longer on the board. That's really important to me. You know what Sarah and Kevin were talking about, I definitely feel like it's really important to be there and be present, but be listening and absorbing and getting educated on what the community wants and how everyone feels before we, ultimately, if we make any decision on this, we want to know what everybody else is thinking and how they're feeling about it. So I just feel like that's a really important piece.
Okay, thank you, Annie. We must be getting close to the end of your time, Nate. Is there anything you need clarity on?
No, so let me, one closing thought, one super helpful conversation. I definitely get the vibe and the direction, enough to kind of put some details. Here's, let me play back what I'm hearing. One, you want to be informed. And so we can definitely put a path through all of this where you are informed all along the way. Second, some of you, I would say, want more voice along at every step than others. Some of you are beat and some of you are more comfortable sitting back a little bit and others not. And I think we can accommodate both. The way I want to do that, though, I do want to acknowledge that having board members in a room and having a dozen of you in the room changes the room. Your presence is something. So I think that there may be, for example, I'll give you just one specific example. I'd rather do something twice to meet all the needs than to try to do it once and meet nobody's needs, very specifically. I'm going to want to meet with the authors of those proposals without you or any of you in the room. Just telling you, I want to hear from them without them thinking, what are you thinking? Without you wanting to jump in. I think we owe it to them. And I also want to be able to say, without you in the room, I don't understand these 3 paragraphs, or you haven't even thought about this. Come back to me with those details. So I think I can help them clarify, flesh out in a low stress, low stakes way. And that's going to make them feel good and have a better plan. Once we get it to a certain place, yeah, I could totally see that we may want them at that point to share back to the whole board this more fleshed out plan. So I think we can accomplish keeping you informed without necessarily having you in the moment. Because again, I think your presence alters the moment. But I don't think that means you can't be there in different ways. I would say, for example, for the few of you who really want to be on the Community Input Committee, I don't think you should be. But I'm more than happy to have either offline, separate meetings with you all individually or as a group. I totally believe your voice should be heard, but I don't believe the community can be heard if there are a couple board members also there. It just changes. So it's not a win and a lose. It's just a couple more meetings and separate and divide sometimes and bring everybody together other times. So if I'm seeing a few heads nodding, if this is not offensive, I think I've definitely got the feel for what you'd like. And I just need to do a lot more thinking on the nitty gritty. So in the proposal that comes back, you will have great clarity on like when you're decision making, when you're listening, when you're going to hear after the fact, when you're going to hear before the fact. So I'd like you to know how I'm thinking about it, and I'm definitely open to you refining it. But this was a really constructive and thoughtful conversation, and the answer will look not like what you're thinking, but will accomplish the things you were hoping to accomplish. So that's my sense.
Krista?
Thanks. Yeah, the one thing I'm struggling with a little bit, and I totally appreciate what you're saying, Nate, especially around the proposals and hearing from those folks. I just want to honor that we requested those, and that I think those folks might also want the board to hear them. And so, but the bigger, sorry if I just might, so I think it, makes sense to have you meet with them, then and we hear the more fleshed out versions. That's fine. The thing that I'm just kind of struggling with a little bit more is, how to ensure that community feels like the board is hearing from them so directly. So we did a lot of engagement over the past 2 years, and the board was actively part of that. And I think that was an important part of the process. And so, I don't want to totally throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just want to make sure that not just for our own edification and information, but for also that trust building and relationship sustaining, that we still we don't create this wall between the community and the board where we can't find a way to sit down together and talk through. I just want to make sure there's a role for that. I don't know where that is, but
let me give you, I think that's very helpful pushback, Krista. And so let me give you like one more example, and I'm going to call it a night. As we evaluate, as we get input from the community on the criteria. Again, I would rather have that conference. I mean, there's 20 people on that committee. If we got another 12 of you there, that's actually a board, not a committee. So I'd like to, they will feel more heard if it's a smaller group. That said, I totally hear that you want to hear from them. So I could see us having one or more planning meeting discussions, me with the input committee. And then the final meeting is where they share back to you all what their thinking is, so that they are telling you directly and you're hearing directly from them. But you're not shaping or swaying their own discussion. And so I think we can have you part of this and give them the space at other times to act. And so I'd say, trust me for at least a week or so, as I need to think through the details more than I am on the fly. But I think we can accomplish both the independence they're going to want and their desire to talk to you and your desire to hear and to speak. So I think we got a bunch of desires. I think it's all doable. And as I started about 40 minutes ago, if I know where you're trying to go, I think we can get you there. And listening in, so Don, thank you for having this conversation tonight. This gives me plenty of sense of how to craft the next steps. So, with that, thank you for all. I know this is not easy, but I do feel like this has been a very thoughtful conversation and moving towards a good plan.
Thank you, Nate.
You're very, very welcome. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye. Okay. Does anybody, do you need a few minute function break or are you good to go, everybody? Okay. All right. Okay, so our next item was an action item, the timeline, and specifically when we put this on the agenda, we were thinking about making a statement one way or the other about whether the board was making a decision at the August retreat. We had talked about it briefly at the last meeting, and I thought there was a majority of us that sounded like we were not thinking of making a decision, but I think we have to come out with a clear statement. And now, given what Nate has said, it may be that we're going to look at the whole timeline eventually again. And, maybe we just want to acknowledge that the timeline is going to be evolving as we go, kind of thing. Steve?
Well, I think Nate's statement that we could wrap this up by the end of the actual year seems like, a reasonable goal, especially if Patrick and Floyd think we can hang on for another budget cycle. And so then the retreat doesn't need to have all that pressure on it, and we can use it for other work.
And on our education pieces we need to fill.
So do you need a motion, Don?
Sure. If you have one in mind, let's give it a shot.
Yeah, I'll make a motion just so we can then discuss it. So I'll make a motion that we do not make the decision about facilities at the August board retreat.
Okay.
Krista?
Krista, was that you? Krista seconded. All right. And Kevin had his hand up to discuss. No?
No, I'm all set. The motion conveys my sentiment.
Okay. Let me run through the list quick. Annie, do you have any comments on not making a decision at the August retreat?
No, I'm going to wait and hear what other people have to say about that, if that's all right.
Sure. Sarah LaPearl, do you have anything?
No, I'm comfortable with that motion. Thank you.
Okay. Andrew made the motion. Andrew, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just made the motion because it sounds like the emerging timeline doesn't fit with making that decision in August. So
Okay.
the timeline continues to evolve.
All right. And Brad. Let's see. Steve.
I'm good.
Okay. Kevin.
All set.
All right. Dave.
I support Andrew's motion.
Okay. Rob.
All set. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. Kristen.
All set.
All right. And Sandy.
All set.
Okay. And Krista.
All set.
All right. So all those in favor of not making a decision at the August retreat regarding the facilities, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Next is a discussion around the Community Engagement Committee feedback. Krista, do you want to take this part and get us started and looking at that? And
Sure. So just a little bit of context. When we met as a full committee, we talked both about communicating out our process and also about the actual vetting process. And we spent time discussing our reactions to the first time we met with Nate, and then really didn't come out with a particular one recommendation for that process, but with some general ideas. And so I tried to capture them in the document I shared. What I did want to first say was at the top, it speaks to what we need to communicate with our community. And so to the point of the timeline that we just moved to push back, I think that will be woven into what we are planning to do as a committee, which is to have a regular presence in Addison Independent that informs the community about our process. I think that also gets to what Nate was talking about this evening, which is to, really be communicating regularly and clearly with the community. So I think, that's the first section there, is that, we need to make sure folks are on board, reminding people what it is that we're grappling with. We have a lot of that language already from our work over the past 2 years that we can use to remind folks and to reflect any changes that have come up since that time, such as, enrollment changes, legislative priorities, things like that. And we also, the committee felt strongly that we should get the proposal submitted by the community onto the website as soon as possible, so everybody can view them. Besides the communication piece, and thinking about Nate's conversation tonight and what he came back with, and the first conversation we had with him, I think that there are pieces in what the Community Engagement Committee discussed around getting levels of input from folks that might fit into the evaluation criteria conversations. We were kind of going off of what we originally heard from him around these, smaller teams and who should form those teams. So I others that were at the meeting can jump in here as well. But my sense is that now that we've heard this conversation, or this proposal from Nate, that it might reshape our thinking a little bit more, particularly around where the places are for stakeholder input. So sorry, I'm a little stumbling because I haven't, the information from Nate was so new and this was prior to that. So, I guess I'm just open to hearing what people's reactions are as to how they fit into what we heard tonight. And I can answer any questions about what we, what the summary was that I presented to everybody.
Sandy has her hand up.
Thanks, Dawn. I think I missed I had to step away for a second. I might have missed the portion where Nate talked about, it was the community input, right? Committee where it could be, he doesn't want it larger than a certain size, not have board members, right? And did he talk about did he make a suggestion about how that would be selected?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah, well, he did say that we could determine like 2 town officials or 3 town, a number and in a position, not a name.
Right.
A number and a position.
So
he said we'd have a separate meeting about that.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like he's going to talk more about that and how we could potentially go about that process. Sounds like he's going to think about that and give something out, which is great. One of the things that came up in last week's meeting, and I don't know, I'm happy to wait to hear what Nate has to propose, but we had talked about if there was a way that we could facilitate or the committee could facilitate particular stakeholders in they themselves gathering together, and then maybe amongst themselves and be able to send a representative to the community, input committee. So for example, like select board members, they probably do their thing anyway, but like, let's say we really try to encourage them to have a forum to talk about their issues and concerns, and maybe have a representative that they would say, hey, you go and be on the community, because we would like, you know what our interests are, you be on that. So I thought about like students, like a gathering for students and facilitating that, a gathering for, parents, in a different setting, because there's so many different stakeholders. And sometimes it's useful to have common stakeholders where they can feel free to talk, amongst themselves, maybe with an agenda or without, with board members or without. But that was discussed at some point. So I imagine that, again, Nate probably has some ideas about how we go about selecting the committee, and maybe we can branch off of that. We could maybe build off of that based on what he says. I just want to make sure that it's just not limited, like that even though we're going to have sort of representatives as part of this committee, that we still are reaching out to the greater community as well. Like they feel not just the people who made the proposals, but everyone else is feeling somehow part of the process as well.
Steve?
Yeah, I guess I would just echo that. I don't know if that Nate's process excludes us from running kind of a parallel track in some regards, where first of all, we're probably going to need to try to encourage whoever we decide this input committee is made up of. We're going to probably need to encourage people to participate on it. Committees are notoriously hard to fill sometimes, and so just that work is important. And then I think encouraging other discussions to happen and facilitating them, and being willing to listen to people outside of the process, and bringing any information that we find out from that to our, to the rest of the board, so that they have that to go along with what Nate uncovers.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin?
Yeah, I would encourage the committee to be a little bit more visionary and develop these outreaches, not only for this particular activity, but for growth and continued development of an engagement with stakeholders, and maybe through the process it lends itself to some of these people that you're seeking out to become part of this specific process, but there's still this wider need for more cross-pollinated involvement.
Anyone else? Oh, Krista.
Yeah, I don't want to cut anybody off. I just had a couple of reflections on what Kevin said.
Sure.
Okay. And Sandy, yeah, that's what I think what I was trying to articulate to Nate, and trying to figure out, and maybe parallel process is the way to say it, is that I recognize there'll be a group of, evaluators or decision makers. And I don't want to forget about everybody else. And I think that really is the work of the Community Engagement Committee. And I'm not sure exactly how to do that work, but I think, well, I shouldn't say I'm not sure exactly how to do that work, because I think we did it well a couple of years ago, where we reached out to specific groups of folks. We really just had some open, dialogue and listening, and captured that. And then it was packaged and shared back to the board. And I think that that I appreciate the robustness of Nate's process, and I want to also, I think from the committee and from my own perspective, it's important to also continue those those other conversations and find a way to ensure that that input gets shared with the board. And to Kevin's point, that would be a great goal, to have that be an ongoing thing we do, not just when we're facing a really big decision. Hopefully we can be building that capacity as we go along. The place where that fits right now, I'm not sure is clear, but I think that's something we can talk about in the Community Engagement Committee.
Okay, anyone else? Kristen?
Yeah, I don't think we would have gotten to the place we've gotten to if we hadn't gone through all that other stuff and engagement and things like that. So I think this is a progression, and actually, you know, that advisory board is going to have it's the ultimate community engagement, because most likely none of us will be there. So.
Krista, I like what you said about finding other ways to sort of infuse that engagement into our process. And I would love to have a conversation about working it more into our regular meeting, business meeting. There's a place for it in there. And I'd love to have, maybe you and I can brainstorm a way to begin bringing it into that way where it should have been all along. So I'd be happy to brainstorm some ideas to use the capacity of that group to help us get some within the confines of our regular business meeting.
That would be great. I don't know if we're there yet, but at some point I would like to just get the okay from folks to post the proposals. If I'd like us to get them on the website. I'm not sure what the thinking is around that, or if we need an action item, but.
I see Rob. I'm not sure how to answer that, Krista. Rob?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I was looking just over Nate's general outline as folks were talking, and not that we've signed on any dotted line yet, but just thinking like, so where, if this were the game plan, like where are the specific sort of tangible community spots where people could show up, and in the one part it's developing the evaluation criteria. Another part, it looks like right now, is that community input committee. I completely agree with Sandy, and from the community engagement meeting last week, and talking about those really specific stakeholder groups, whether they're principals, whether they're students, whether they're teachers, whether they're business leaders in our community, whether they're select board members, or I think it'd be great if they could chat amongst themselves too. I don't know where in the process that would be, if that's creating the, I don't think in my first run through that's the evaluation criteria. I think that's more sitting down with the evaluation criteria and the different proposals possibly. That's just sort of where my head's at, but I'm still trying to mesh the two together. And I completely agree with Kevin and what you've said, Dawn and Krista's. Those are pretty specific asks, but how do we continue to engage along the way with communication, so that if we reach out and say, hey, would you be on this community input committee, and someone's just like, for what? Then we haven't maybe done our job to the level that we should. So that's just what I'm thinking.
Steve?
I don't know why we wouldn't put them on the website. They're already public record, having been posted to our emails and whatever else. It's not like we're hiding anything, so I don't know why we couldn't put them on the website.
I like that, Steve. That makes sense to me.
I'm wondering, do you think that all the authors realize that when they sent that, or is that just something we should double check to make sure that everybody is okay with that before we do it?
I think the only thing we might want to note, or at least allow the authors to understand, is that Nate is proposing kind of an understanding period, maybe an adjustment period, and that the proposal that may finally get evaluated may not necessarily be the one that's getting posted today. There's going to be sort of a pre-evaluation adjustment phase. That step might want to be clarified on whatever page we're using to post these.
Sandy?
I had a quick idea. When you said we should check to see what the proposers were thinking, I just wondered if it was worthwhile having them be anonymous, but to put the proposals up so people can just see what the ideas that are out there. I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not, but it just popped in my head as maybe a thought. I'm wondering what people think.
Well, they're not very anonymous if you read them.
Oh, well, you'd be surprised. You know, not everybody is, you know, connected, but if they know proposals are up, they may not have any idea.
There's bios in them.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It's true. You're right.
Kevin?
Some might want to be anonymous though, and some might not.
Oh man, I'm having a senior moment. I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay, go back to where you were and it'll come back to you. I don't have a problem reaching out to the people who submitted them and say, hey, are you okay? We're going to put them on the website so everybody can see them. But I think it's also, as I was thinking about Nate's description of it, it almost makes me think like it's a little, Nate's going to do a little dress rehearsal with them and he's going to work it all out before, you know, we get to hear what it all means kind of thing. So I feel like this is just the first glimpse at them and they might look a little, you know, a little more refined or tweaked or something as they go along. Annie?
I was just going to say that I do think it's a good idea to put them on the website so that it looks, I mean, so that we are being transparent, not that it looks like, but we are being transparent. But I agree that I think that we should make sure that everybody who submitted one knows that and is okay with that before we do it. That feels important to me.
Okay, thanks, Annie. Kevin?
Okay, I came back. So as far as putting up the raw proposals, I got the impression Nate would make commentary, not change the proposals. So while there may be revs to them as the process unfolds, they won't be changed per se. So I'm not sure. I'm concerned about changing him redoing the proposals, I guess is what I kind of heard at one point. And I do agree with the fact that people should be asked. It seems like they would know they'd be public or about to become public, but it's a courtesy.
Okay, so I'll reach out to people and I don't think we need an action item because we have that facilities page that we've been regularly posting on as well, unless Patrick, I'm missing something. I think if people are okay with it, the authors are okay with it, then we'll just put them to that page where all that other information is going.
Yeah, I agree. I think the question that's unanswered is, what if the authors aren't okay? Doesn't make them any less public a document, as Steve mentioned before.
You're right.
I would think the assumption is that if people put those out there, they'd be public documents. But I think it's still important to ask, but I would just assume that if you're applying something to like this, and if you didn't understand that, then, you know, we don't have to put it on, but.
Okay, Annie?
I was just thinking maybe it's not so much that we're asking them if it's okay to put it up there. Maybe it's more that we're letting them know that we're putting it up there and we are asking them if they would like to would like it to be anonymous or be more anonymous. You know what I mean?
Okay. Okay. All right. I will check in with the authors and then once I hear from them, I'll get it to the right people to get it on the right page. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. And the next item, I just realized we didn't put the link on. We had a draft and it didn't get linked to the discussion item about the community invitation to join the merger study committee. Patrick, I think I shared that with you. Are you able to share a screen so that people could get a look at it and then we can have it posted in the minutes? And then if there's any feedback, they can give it, and so we can get this out because the Addison Northwest has already put something out.
Let me find it and then I'll share my screen.
Okay. Kevin?
Have we determined the makeup of our representatives? Or do we need to determine a makeup?
What? I don't think we did a makeup. We did a number. And some of the language that we worked through at that joint meeting.
I have the invitation ready to share when you're ready, Don.
Okay, I guess go ahead, and then people can look at it. And I think, can you make it a little bigger?
Yep.
Thank you.
Dawn, I see it's a discussion item, not an action item. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you need action on it soon?
I can take action to just
Mhm.
as chair and get it out there, but what I want you to do is look at it, and I can, after this meeting, I'll share the document, and then if you have feedback, send it so that, as I said, Addison Northwest has already put something out in the public, and this would just be our sort of public announcement to start getting interested people to contact us.
I think it looks good.
I think it's fine. I don't think we need, I mean, these are pretty standard when you're doing committees, right? It's not, we usually don't vote on them, I don't think.
Right. No, I just wanted, I know this board likes to give feedback on stuff that goes out on behalf of the board. So I wanted you all to be able to have a chance to do that. See, Rob's got his hand up, and Kevin.
Yeah, just a clarifying question. I think it's a second bullet point. So Dawn, you'll gather these interested letters. And let's say you get 20. I'm not saying you will. Will you only then bring 9 to the board and we approve those 9? Or what does that look like on the back end? Not, I guess, more logistics than this letter.
No, I would bring, in my mind, I would just bring them all and we, you know, maybe I might say, here's my recommendation, but tell me what you think.
How many community members did you decide would be on that committee? Usually it's like 1 or 2.
Yeah, we didn't, I don't think we did any of that. We just specified board members and left it open so that, you know, it might end up it's 2 board members, but at least 1. And we didn't really specify, we talked about having students and community, but we didn't give them numbers.
So when would we do that? Because usually, I mean, usually these committees sort of have a set amount of all that. I mean, when we go for a superintendent or a principal or something.
Yeah, I think we do that because I'm going to bring the letters of interest and we'll use that as part of our, as a group, to decide that.
Because often we've said in these letters, you know, we're looking for 2 members from the community in the actual letter, but we haven't made that decision. I'm sorry, I couldn't go to that meeting. My kids have been in a car accident. They're fine now, but
Oh, no.
I needed to deal with them that evening. So yeah, they're fine. They're fine.
Kevin.
So I think I said this before, but I'll reiterate it again, just because I like to talk sometimes. But I would like to see, or I would recommend, or whatever, that this committee group is made up 1/3 community, 1/3 school related, and 1/3 board. And school related would be administrative or teachers or whatever, you know.
All right, Krista and then Sarah.
I think, sorry, I think one of the reasons why it was kept open was just because we weren't sure who would be interested. So I don't know if you want to put that in and then don't get the representation you're looking for. What does that mean? Do we go back to the drawing board, or, you know, I think that's where it could get tricky.
Right.
I've just seen every other time we've prescribed it ahead of time and people have always volunteered. So, I mean, it's weird to me to do it the other way. So I'm sorry, I've just done it for 10 years the other way. So that you have a certain amount of slots and then fill them, and have never had a problem filling them, I don't think.
Sarah?
I'm just clarifying that the board members also apply the same way by June 1st, any board, like,
Yes,
okay.
that's correct. And Steve?
Well, since ANWSD already put out their invitation and we didn't agree on slots, I think our best option is to do what Don suggests and just put it out there openly and then filter it at the back end.
Right. And Kevin?
I would encourage the thought process that if we have strategic groups that we want on this committee and they don't initially step up, that we go looking for them, as opposed to putting whoever wants to show up because on it because they showed up type thing, and they're not really part of a strategic group that we're looking for.
That's good advice. Okay. All right, so that's helpful feedback that I've gotten so far, and I will give a couple more days. I'll share this with you all. It'll be attached to the minutes for the community member, for, you know, our communities to see it, and then a couple more days and then we should get it out. So in the next couple of days, if you have thoughts, please send them along to me individually, and then we'll get it out.
I'll look up what it was for the last merger committee, what the breakdown was. So I'll check that out in the charter.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right, and then the next thing for us to take on is the discussion about items for this next facilities meeting. I would assume there'll be something to talk about Nate's proposal, so I assume that'll be one thing.
Mm.
Are there any other items that we need to cover? We talked in the beginning about when we started this facilities committee that we'd set time aside at the end of a meeting to work on the agenda together. So this is our opportunity.
And that meeting is the 8th, correct?
I think so. Sounds right.
So we'll be having a community engagement committee meeting the Tuesday before. Could we just hold a space for an update from the committee? Because I'm thinking maybe we would spend a little more time talking about some of the things we discussed earlier around, you know, ongoing ways to engage folks in this process.
Okay. All right. I'll put that on. Does anyone else have any other thoughts? Okay. All right.
So just to process question, we'll be meeting in June, which is the meeting we're talking about. We won't have a meeting in July.
Correct.
And we will pick up meetings, facilities meetings in August or September.
August, we have our retreat, and the retreat did. So the retreat landed on the 16th, if I'm remembering correctly. And I know, Patrick, you usually have an admin meeting in the beginning. Is it the beginning of August? Is that going to?
We do. There are currently two meetings planned for August. One is the retreat, and the other is the business meeting for August. Last year, or maybe year before, we separated those. We used to have sort of one longer day to do both, but we can add another meeting specific to facilities if we need to.
Okay. Krista.
I was just wondering if we anticipate Nate, like when we think Nate might have fleshed out more of the details and timing after this conversation, and then maybe that would give us a better sense of what things would look like in August.
Probably, yes. We probably have a little more information. Okay, so we won't plan on an August facilities meeting until we get some more information. We'll just leave it open at this point then. Okay. All right. Any other things about the agenda? Okay. I'm going to move along. We don't need an executive session. Is there any public comment at this time? Okay, I'm not seeing anybody's hand up. Okay. Meeting evaluation. Chris, can you help us?
I got it.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Are we ending in under 3 hours?
Yes.
No
I think that-
way. Well done.
What is the level of engagement of all board members, high or low? I'm gonna go with high.
I'm seeing thumbs.
Moving on. Was the agenda followed? Yes or no? I'm gonna go with yes. Okay,
Yep.
any comments? Okay. Does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board? Yes or no? Any comments? Okay. Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of the board process? Yes or no? Any comments? Rob?
I appreciated you, Don, putting us on the spot tonight in regards to the question relating to board engagement and timeline over the summer. And I also appreciated how you broke those two apart so that people like myself didn't ramble on.
Thanks.
Other feedback for the chair? What went well with the meeting? Under 3 hours? Okie dokie. Suggestions for ways to improve future meetings? That's a wrap.
All right. So the only thing left is a motion to adjourn at 8:16.
Rob,
So
so
moved.
moved.
All right, Rob,
Your second, whatever.
I'll second Andrew.
Andrew. All right, all those in favor of adjourning at 8:16, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Done.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.